Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things about ayahuasca is the way in which it has entered into whatever you want to call it, the counterculture, psychedelic culture, uh, with a ritualistic and quasi religious dimension to it intact, changing, transforming, but still intact. I mean, it's long been one of the kind of keen issues in the Western use of psychedelics is this question about its spiritual or religious dimension. That while clearly many people have extraordinarily religious or spiritual experiences on these compounds, that the framework for experiencing them is often more or less secular. It's in the guise of a kind of psychotherapeutic guided therapeutic session on the one hand, or it's in a more open-ended framework in another, whether people are taking them in, Grateful Dead concerts, or they're going out to the woods with their friends, or they're creating some kind of environment in their home. And of course, when you take into mind the set and setting factor, it's obviously clear that the sort of ritualistic or religious framework or expectations that you bring to these experiences really helps shape their meaning and what people take away from it. And it strikes me as indicating something more than cultural, that ayahuasca has entered in with a kind of retention of a religious or ritualistic form in a way that nothing else has, in the sense that that many people who would be exploring that compound now, whether they're living in Western countries or whether they're getting on the plane and going to South America, experience it or want to experience it, even need to experience it through one of the modalities that has been developed inside of a more explicitly ritualistic or religious framework. I believe that's partly because the energies that are invoked, or the signatures of that particular compound, are in some ways they demand or they ask or they request for a certain kind of framework of intentionality than maybe other compounds, which can be equally powerful, equally transformative in their religious or spiritual or psychological effects, don't quite have. That there's a trace of some a sort of numinosity, or a kind of trace of a real otherness that these things have, that sort of demand that framework. So there's a lot of really interesting things that are happening in terms of like how that compound is floating through the culture, and as people recognize that it's all over the place, that you don't actually even need the traditional brew in order to achieve these effects. Nonetheless, these kinds of ritualistic frameworks are carrying forward, and you're finding this opening up of a whole new kind of, wandering white ayahuasquero with their songs and their mixtures of traditions which themselves were already transforming historically under conditions of modernity in South America, but are now being further transformed as they pick up elements of, hippie culture and Rastafarianism and all sorts of stuff. And yet it retains this really powerful religious character. And I think that one of the things that's done is that it's allowed the effects of this particular mixture or set of mixtures to really have a potential for a greater and more transformative meaning in the lives of a lot of people who encounter it, where it's sort of a given that if you're going to be dealing with the substance and the wisdom behind the substance, or the experiences behind the substance, the entities behind the substance, that there's a kind of seriousness about the endeavor. There's a difficulty about the endeavor, a kind of arduous character to aspects of it that sort of ramps up the seriousness. It makes it much less likely that it becomes a recreational thing. And this really, to my mind, has a great deal of power behind it, and helps explain why it's such a why it is such a transformative substance for so many people. That said, it also raises a lot of very interesting and in some ways problematic questions about religion and about belief and about expectation, in the sense that people are often more willing to ascribe sort of, straight meaning from these experiences. It's like, oh yes, I got the message from the mother vine that this is the way I'm supposed to be, or that I have these kind of visions in there, and there's often a kind of a sort of release into like something I can finally believe. Here's something that I can finally accept, which in some ways, to my mind, also runs a little bit against the function that these things have in Western culture, which to my mind is this kind of two-edged sword of simultaneously opening up to the numinous world, to the world of messages, the world of spirits, the world of entities, and at the same time rigorously sort of, taking that material into the acid bath of neurology, into sociology, into the construction, the ongoing construction of reality. And that the wisdom that these things bring is this kind of very tricky mixture of authentic religious experience with gods and messages and clear signs, and a sort of remarkable mirror of the mind. And it seems no accident that these things are sort of coming up, coupled with our plunge into neuroscience and our plunge into in ever more fine mechanistic explanations of the ongoing human construction of subjective reality. Because it's actually kind of a funny paradox that I don't think a lot of neuroscientists have quite recognized, which is that if you really want to be a good materialist and you want to create a descriptive account of human consciousness, then you really have to create a descriptive account of all the realms of human consciousness, which forces you in a kind of bass-ackwards way into directly encountering mysticism and psychedelic experience in its full-blown, most remarkable, most numinous quality. Because if you're not doing that, then you're a hypocrite. Then you're kind of bullshitting yourself. So at earlier phases of a more, let's say, crude psychological understanding, you could kind of sweep this stuff under the carpet of pathology. Oh, it's a kind of madness. We really don't need to have to deal with that. But now it's like, look, there's extraordinarily regular phenomena that come up with these things that are clearly linked in many ways to these larger human issues around mysticism or religious experience or encounters with other entities. And here we have it. And if you can't go in there and really go in there and account for this material inside your neuroscientific framework, you're leaving a huge gap. You got to account for this stuff the way you got to account for dreams, the way you got to account for all sorts of psychoactive responses. So it's this funny paradox where if you're really going to be taking your materialism seriously, you kind of have to take drugs. And if you're not, then there's always going to be this gap. There's always going to be this question of like, well, what is religious experience? What is an encounter with a spectral other? What is this kind of explosion of dense, meaningful encounter that seems so real and so deep in comparison with the waking dream? So it's a very funny paradox that I don't think has quite sort of gotten out of the bag yet, that there's no way out of a full-on confrontation with the full range of experience that is implied and contained inside of these experiences.